You're listening to the Diplomats podcast on Asian geopolitics. As always, I'm your host, Ankit Panda, here from New York City. I'm editor-at-large at The Diplomat and a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I'm delighted to be joined by Hervé Lemahieu from the Lowy Institute. Hervé, thank you so much for joining me back on the podcast today. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
It's a pleasure to have you back, and some of our longer-term subscribers might be familiar with your work. The reason we have Hervé back on the show today is to talk about the latest iteration of the Lowy Institute's Asia Power Index for 2020. And for listeners who aren't familiar, this is basically the Lowy Institute's and specifically Hervé's attempts to taxonomize and classify all of the Asia-Pacific's or the Indo-Pacific states in terms of their relative power rankings. And it's a really impressive effort. I'll add a link in the show notes to the interactive website where viewers are able to browse the relative the content and take a look at the specific factors affecting relative change from previous years. But Hervé, obviously this year is a particularly interesting one to undertake a project like this because, of course, we do have a once-in-a-100-year global pandemic, the first really in the information age, so to speak, and that has had some dramatic implications for the relative power of various Asian states. I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of your top-line observations on how exactly COVID-19, in your view, has affected first of all, the undertaking. I mean, just methodologically, I know we talked a little bit about this when I had you on the podcast last year, just in terms of the methodology. But how did you go about accounting for the pandemic's implications for relative power shifts in the region?
Sure thing. Yeah, it was methodologically a very challenging year. And in fact, we had to delay the launch by 5 months in order to try to capture the most recently available data. And to have a serious look at our 10-year forecasts for military spending and GDP in light of the impact that the pandemic has had on the economic fundamentals of countries in the region. And perhaps unsurprisingly, but still, I mean, quite dramatically, the onset of COVID-19 has caused the biggest shakeup of power in the region outside of wartime, I would argue. It's really caused a race to the bottom between Asian powers. It's in that sense has both accelerated power shifts, but in a downward direction. Whereas in prior years we were used to global wealth and power moving eastwards. And in fact, in 2019, Asia had been poised to become larger than the rest of the world economy combined. So what was driving shifts in power was essentially fundamentally the growth of Asian economies, and some were growing faster than others, and some were investing in their military capability more than others. But the point was the region at large was broadly becoming more prosperous. The Asian century, though, has taken a very abrupt turn in its fortunes. And what we see this year is that 18 countries in the Indo-Pacific experienced significant downward shifts in their relative power in 2020. None more so than the United States, which remains the most powerful player in the region, but whose lead over second place China has narrowed by half in 2 years. So that is quite interesting. Not only has that lead between the US and China narrowed, and China appears to be accelerating the pace at which it's leveling with the United States, but the region has also become more bipolar in the sense that the distance between the US and China versus everyone else has increased with a notable drop in the relative power of both India and Japan, who constitute our third and fourth ranked powers. Japan being third and India being fourth. Sorry, they are sort of major powers. They stand in between sort of our classification of middle powers and our superpowers, but both have dropped, and India has dropped to the extent that it actually no longer qualifies as a major power this year. Just by a small margin, it is now a high-performing middle power. So in other words, we're dealing with a more fractious region, a more disorderly one, a more dangerous one. and a more bipolar one as well. But it doesn't look as if a very fluid balance of power. It doesn't look as if the US and China have reached any degree of stability or understanding about what the endpoint in Asia might look like.
Right. So, your observations about the United States, I think, are spot on. I say this as someone obviously living here at the moment, and someone who spends a lot of time watching the U.S. posture in Asia. Certainly, it's been striking to talk to friends and colleagues overseas who've just been wondering, what happened with the way the United States handled the pandemic. And I think your report, the accompanying report to the launch of the Asia Power Index, which I took some time to read, I think has some compelling explanations, of course, for places where the United States still retains significant advantages, primarily in the monetary policy realm, and just in terms of the United States' overall continued centrality to the global financial system. But you also talk about the role of the U.S. administration's general unilateral outlook. Could you say a little bit more about that, about how, and I know you commented about this in the previous Power Index too, which is under the Trump administration, the U.S. has had a sort of, quote, America first unilateralist approach to international affairs. How has the pandemic sort of intersected with that in a way that has resulted in this dramatic downgrade this year in overall U.S. power in the Indo-Pacific?
Look, it's been an acceleration of existing trends on the one hand. So, we've already observed the fact that the Trump administration's emphasis on renegotiating free trade agreements, balancing trade flows one country at a time, engaging in trade wars, not simply with China, but some of its primary partners, strategic partners in the region. All that has really not kept pace with the rise of Chinese economic soft power, if that's what you can call it. And so that sort of unilateral inclination has hurt the US's standing in the region. It's broader than that as well. I mean, if you look at the way the global pandemic politics played out this year, the urge to find a scapegoat really for the US's own failures in its domestic handling of COVID-19 meant that the US withdrew from the World Health Organization. Sure, the World Health Organization is imperfect, but the point is it is a multilateral institution, and one in which you would hope the US could maintain a level of influence, because certainly it's China's desire to increase its influence over multilateral forums. Then there is obviously the fact that the region at large has grown to adapt in the absence of U.S. Regional leadership. So the resuscitation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership deal in 2018, minus the United States, with 11 powers here in Asia, was a prime example of that. The region is trying to make do the best it can without U.S. leadership. I mean, another multilateral trade agreement is that's being negotiated at the moment is the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which includes China but doesn't include the United States. So the U.S. has fallen further behind the major multilateral initiatives in this region, and it's hurt its overall clout. Where the U.S. has made some inroads is in terms of its investment in selective multilateralism, or what you might call minilateralism, particularly in defense diplomacy. So that's the quadrilateral grouping and other initiatives. But these have not made up for the general loss of multilateral clout that the U.S. has experienced in the region.
Mm-hmm. And of course, yeah, I mean, we look at Asia and we see huge demand within the region for trade integration. The U.S., unfortunately, if you look at our domestic politics here, appetite for multilateral trade agreements just isn't there on either side of the aisle. But speaking of domestic politics, and here we're recording this on October 19th, just 2 weeks before the U.S. elections. So this is sort of an obligatory question, but what I wanted you to reflect on a little bit is, how much inertia is there in this dramatic downgrading this year in the U.S. position? If as polls suggest, we do indeed have a change of government in the United States, and we have a more multilaterally inclined Democratic nominee in the form of Joe Biden enter office in January 2021. Do you see a scope for the U.S. to perhaps stage a dramatic comeback in the 2021 iteration of the Asia Power Index?
Well, it's certainly what a lot of U.S. allies, including Australia, hope for the United States coming out of the election. It would bolster their own standing in the region to have a more engaged United States that's capable of stabilizing its regional leadership. No one necessarily expects a return to the sort of Obama era. There are things the United States can do to shore up its position, and it's noteworthy that a lot of the factors that led to the decline of U.S. Influence and the loss of prestige in Asia are down to political choice more than structural forces, right? So they are theoretically reversible, and there is much the U.S. can do. When it comes to the rise of China, however, I question whether the US can do very much about that. I think we are, one way or another, moving towards a situation where the US has lost its unipolar moment. China becomes a bipolar equal. Perhaps the US can maintain a relationship where it's first among equal superpowers in Asia, or China narrowly edges it. But either way, I think neither the United States nor China will really be able to claim undisputed primacy in this region. Those days are behind us, and I think many of the US's allies recognize that. But there are things that the US and its allies and its partners can do to shore up the collective balance of power. Mm-hmm. And the role of middle powers in a situation where neither the US nor China can really dominate the other actually becomes more consequential. So you would hope that the United States realizes that its comparative advantages over China in Asia really lies in its network power, and this has been underutilized by the Trump administration. You would hope that we see an emphasis shift under a new Biden administration. I would, though, say that there is a great deal of unease, even if Biden does prevail in the election. In Australia, we follow U.S. politics religiously, and the margin of his victory will either reassure us or worry us about the durability of to what extent Trumpism as a political movement has really been extinguished in the United States, or whether we can expect 4 years of Biden presidency to be a temporary reprieve before moving back into something that again looks more populist and more unilateral and less predictable from the United States.
That's right. Yes, I think the thing that our allies and partners find most discomforting is whiplash between a Democratic administration and a Republican administration, and certainly a landslide victory for Biden with potentially changes in the alignment of the U.S. Senate, for instance, I think sends a very different message than a much closer victory. But enough about the United States and China, because I think what's actually interesting is looking at the analysis in the Asia Power Index. I mean, I think you emphasize this, which is that a lot of Asia's middle powers and smaller states in general have been the ones to come out of this last year, both having improved their international reputation and having handled the pandemic well. So it's been a fascinating year, in particular for countries like Taiwan, New Zealand, Vietnam, and you have this great graph on page 8 of your report, which I'll link to in the show notes again, showcasing, on the y-axis, international reputation, on the x-axis, domestic handling of the COVID-19 pandemic, and those 3 countries that I just mentioned are all the way in the top right, having significantly enhanced their standing in the world this year by virtue largely of handling the pandemic very well. So tell me a little bit about these states. We can also add South Korea and Australia in there as well, which are also in the top right quadrant, albeit not quite at the superlative corner that these other countries are. But what do you see as the longer term implications for these countries having handled the pandemic the way they have?
Yeah, I think what it does is remind us that the ability of countries to enjoy a positive standing or reputation in the region begins with domestic leadership and the competency of authorities in dealing with large-scale public health challenges like a pandemic. But it doesn't need to be a pandemic. It can also be, climate change or any number of other non-traditional security threats to the population. And we've seen this trend for a while now, we've been underlying the point that the countries with the most internal strength, the most resilience, tend to be smaller. It's in a way it's also easier, right? If you're Singapore and you're a city state of 5.6 million people, it's easier to competently govern a smaller country than it is to govern a country the size of the US or let alone the size of India or China. And so these countries have excelled with this kind of challenge in relative terms, obviously, because everyone's suffered in broader terms. But what's interesting is that doing well or handling the pandemic well was a sort of necessary but not sole condition for performing well in the Age of Power Index this year. So of the three exceptions to the rule of a race to the bottom, only three countries gained or improved their relative standing in the index this year. All three are middle powers. All three have done well in terms of handling the pandemic, and that is Australia, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Very diverse countries, obviously separated by quite a few rankings. Taiwan coming up from a very low base, Vietnam having overtaken New Zealand in ranked 12th this year, and Australia overtaking South Korea ranked 6th. But it is interesting that not every country that has done well, so in the pandemic, such as New Zealand or South Korea, has done well in the index. I mean, they've actually both fallen behind. So the way we're styling this is that you need to have your ducks in order in terms of your domestic ability to govern, but it takes more than that to shape the region and the course of international events, and that's what both or all three, what Vietnam, Taiwan, and Australia all illustrate, is that at the margins they have shaped the regional order, and that is why they have improved their standing.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, when I take a look at the index and I reflect on the sort of relative projections for what is to come ahead, I think one of the most pessimistic projections actually concerns Japan, which, correct me if I'm wrong, but the index judges as perhaps the country that will take the longest to recover economically, at least, from the effects of the pandemic. And of course, this comes on the heels of two lost decades and an attempt under former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe to invigorate the economy with structural reforms to hopefully fix the malaise that had long gripped Japan's economy. What should we take away from this year's analysis of Japan's relative prospects for the coming years?
Yeah, so I think the more than any loss of reputation or prestige, what will matter more in coming years is the sequencing of economic recoveries from this from the pandemic. It's perhaps surprising to audiences in the US and in Europe that even though Asia as a whole has done better relative to other regions, certainly in the West, at handling the health pandemic, the economic fallout has been just as pronounced here. And for many advanced economies, it will take many more years before they can reach pre-COVID levels of economic output again. Whereas for China, it's really the only global major economy that will see a rebound in terms of its economic growth in 2020, despite the economic fallout from the pandemic in earlier quarters. So it is first off the marks, and that will consolidate China's economic lead in this region. Japan obviously faces a recession that's induced in the first instance by the pandemic, but obviously is exacerbated by an aging population, low productivity, and these structural dragging forces that will basically slow down its ability to kind of grow again at the levels it was pre-COVID. So in our forecast, we don't expect Japan to really come back to its pre-COVID levels of economic output until 2027. For the US, it's an open question. Much depends on the dynamism and recovery of its economy. But we come up with a sort of quite a sort of pessimistic take that it might take until 2023 or 2024 before the United States recovers its pre-COVID levels of economic output. So the sequencing matters, but it's not just the sequencing. It's also developing economies who will grow either in 2020 or 2021. They still have, though, been hardest hit in relation to their growth trajectories pre-pandemic. So India, for example, one of the world's largest emerging economies, nevertheless will be, we expect it to be 13% smaller by the end of this decade than we had forecast for India last year for 2030. And that means that the power or the economic power differential between China and India has actually expanded as a result of the pandemic. And India will, in effect, only reach about 40% of China's economic output by the end of this decade, as opposed to the 50% we had predicted for it last year. And that is also reinforcing the sort of bipolarity of Asia.
Right. So, coming back to China a little, so from the index, I take it that China is relatively holding fast on many measures of its overall power this year. But one of the interesting ones has been China's general diplomatic influence across the region. And, a few weeks before, or a little over a week before the Lowy Power Index was released, Pew released survey data showing perceptions of China, not only in the Indo-Pacific region, but around the world, had declined over the course of the pandemic, partly as a result of affirmative efforts by China diplomatically, the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which hasn't gone over so well around the world, but also generally reactions to how Beijing handled the COVID-19 pandemic early on in January, but also since then. Talk a little bit about that, because I take it in your in your analysis, you come down on China's diplomatic influence in the region still outclassing that of the United States, and I think that's an interesting observation. So, how likely is China's overall diplomatic hit from the way it managed the pandemic early on and its other diplomatic behaviors? How is that going to affect things? Do you think going forward into next year and the years to come?
Well, I think I can't emphasize enough how much of a lost opportunity the pandemic was for Chinese regional diplomacy. In a different world, it could have made use of this opportunity as a way of, well, firstly, acknowledging and rectifying the fact that the pandemic had originated from China. So you're absolutely right. I mean, we don't just look at what countries have in terms of their economic size, but also what countries do with what they have in terms of their diplomacy, in terms of their economic relationship, in terms of their defense networks in the region. And on these measures, China does lag, at least in terms of defense diplomacy and conventional diplomacy. It has reached near level parity with Japan, which is ranked second in the region for diplomatic influence. Really, the only reason that China is ahead on diplomatic influence in Asia speaks more to the failures of U.S. regional leadership than it does the successes of Chinese diplomatic leadership in the region. In fact, I mean, if you break down our diplomatic influence measure, we have a number of indicators, most of which are quantitative. So we look at multilateral influence and we assess that by looking at UN voting alignment, contributions to multilateral development banks, the size and reach of diplomatic networks. But among a subset of diplomatic influence indicators, we have actually asked a number of policymakers and experts from the region to give us their assessment of the capacity of various powers to exercise political and regional leadership. And it's interesting that this year Japan ranks ahead of China for its ability to conduct global diplomatic leadership, and Singapore, of all countries, ranks ahead of China for its regional leadership. So something has gone wrong for China, and this is a missed opportunity. I mean, I can't emphasize that enough. In a different world, in a sort of post-factual history, You could envisage a situation where China, at the very very early days of the rapid global spread of COVID, having acknowledged its problems or its failures in reporting accurate data on a timely basis to convey the severity of the scale of the challenge. You could envisage a world where China really led in terms of regional recovery efforts, but it has not done so. In fact, we've seen from China the rise of a far more belligerent tone in its diplomacy through wolf warrior diplomacy. We've seen threats of economic coercion leveled at various countries in the region, including Australia. Its largest trading. Well, for Australia, China is its largest trading partner, and for a variety of reasons, China is or has emerged from this crisis diplomatically diminished. Now, the U.S. Has done even worse, and that's it's not great news for either superpowers, but it's worse news for the United States. So I don't want to mislead audiences into thinking that simply because the U.S. is behind on China in terms of diplomatic influence, that China is doing well. I don't think either superpower is doing particularly well at the moment.
Right. Yeah, it's not a happy year for either the U.S. or China. So just as I close out, I mean, obviously, I think a lot of this sets up 2021 as a pivotal year. It'll be the year that really determines the pace of recovery and relative change from what has been a very difficult year for many countries' power rankings. As you note, the large majority of states in Asia have taken a hit. I suspect I know what your answer is going to be, but I mean, what is the most important thing for most of these countries to really focus on in 2021? I mean, my guess would be getting the pandemic under control, and obviously, there are other variables like the availability of a vaccine and the internationalization of a vaccine. But is there something else that we should be thinking about looking forward to next year?
It sort of depends but for every country, it'll be a different set of challenges. But certainly, I think if there's a general trend, it is that the region at large and perhaps the world is far more inward looking. You have to tend to your own wounds first before you can start projecting influence into the region again. And those that recover fastest will be in the best position to exercise leadership on the Asian stage. And now, when it comes to a country like Australia, it's really interesting. Even though we've done well in the index this year, if you look at the bottom line, our economic contraction is going to be worse than either Vietnam or Taiwan, and a lot of that is to do with the fact that we've dropped out of the demographic Goldilocks zone. I mean, we are one of the few advanced economies alongside the United States that has high productivity and still enjoys a growing working age population. But our migrant intake has dropped to negative levels for the first time since the Second World War. So that has the potential, if that trend continues, to really undermine the fundamentals for Australia as a young and growing middle power. That means that if we don't alter that trend within the next coming years, that's a very pressing challenge. We will be a smaller, less secure, poorer nation, and so we'll have to watch out for that when it comes to Australia. Other countries, again, it depends on how severely affected they've been from the pandemic, but certainly South Asia and much of developing Asia has to deal with the emergence of a new class of COVID poor. I mean, there'll be 78 million more people that fall under the international poverty line of living on $1.90 a day as a direct result of this pandemic. So that alone generates all manner of inequality and development challenges, and I expect that much of emerging Asia will be focused on these issues more than they are on traditional security for the year ahead.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hervé, I really want to thank you for joining me on the Asia Geopolitics podcast to go over the important results of this latest effort. So congratulations, and thanks again for coming back.
Thank you for having me, Ankit. I always enjoy being on your show.
Absolutely. So my guest is Hervé Lemayeux. He's the director of the Power and Diplomacy program at the Lowy Institute, having recently published the 2020 Asia Power Index, which again, I will link to in the show notes. So for listeners, if you've been a subscriber to the podcast, but you haven't yet left us a review, we'd really appreciate if you could do that. It really helps get the word out about the show. And if you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. We'd love for you to keep up with future coverage on this podcast. Finally, before we close, a quick note from our sponsor. This episode of the Asia Geopolitics Podcast is brought to you by Diplomat Risk Intelligence, or DRI. DRI is the consulting and analysis division of The Diplomat, the Asia-Pacific's leading current affairs magazine. Since its launch in 2002, The Diplomat has been dedicated to quality analysis and commentary on events and trends in Asia and around the world, and is now one of the most respected publications covering the region. DRI inherits this approach and offers clients in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors worldwide access to an exclusive network of subject matter experts and analysts. Whatever your needs in the wider Asia-Pacific region, DRI can offer the knowledge and expertise necessary to anticipate and manage geopolitical and geoeconomic risks. For more information, please visit dri.thediplomat.com. Thanks a lot for listening, and we'll be back soon with more.